Sam is going to be talking to us about about PMGSY primarily, and I think I've seen versions of this presentation over the last couple of years that you've been working on this. I'm excited to see how far you've progressed, and no doubt everyone here at CPR is quite excited too. It's quite a large turnout for a Friday afternoon just before the long weekend. So we will talk about the colors on your slides, but also something more substantive and substantial through this conversation. Thanks for making the time to be here, Sam. Look forward to it.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction and for coming. It is, I think, a shockingly high turnout. I almost suspect that the internet's not working or something else has gone wrong.
We really like the biscuits.
The biscuits. That's what.
Banana chips.
It's the banana chips.
That's
it's the banana chips.
They don't normally bring those. That's
I'm going to
special.
start bringing these to my other presentations. Yeah. That's good. Good. And it's particularly nice to present this stuff here. I've now presented this in a lot of academic presentations, as well as some sort of more policy-focused ones. And I think that, CPR sitting at that intersection, this should be a particularly good place to get feedback. Though I have to admit that after years of working on this paper, I'm starting to get a little bit sick of it. I hope that doesn't show up in how I present it, but try to make your suggestions that will really revolutionize this paper, because if they're small, I'm just not sure that I can do any more corrections on this paper at this point. Good. This is part of a larger agenda that I have with my co-author Paul Novosad, who I've been working with ever since grad school, really trying to understand the process of growth and structural transformation. We both are interested in these big determinants of development, of growth, but recognize, as many people do, that it's very difficult to do it across countries where way too many things differ. And so what we do in a lot of our research agenda is study the within-country distribution of growth and economic activity as a way of trying to bite off sort of smaller pieces of this larger question of what drives economic growth, but really do it in a setting where in India you have policies that are constant at the national level, institutions that are more constant, and various other things that you can sort of hold constant and take advantage of policies and other often geographical variation to try to understand what is it that drives growth and development. So we have these different papers that are looking at the role of natural resources. We have papers that look at both the role of natural resources on global political and economic activity, local politics, kind of look in the other direction, how politics affects economic activity at the very local level. And then today I'll be talking about transportation infrastructure. And so, this is a slide that I've added relatively recently. Why study rural roads? For one, roads are very expensive. I'll talk about just how expensive this program is. But two, I think while a lot of people, particularly in policy circles, feel like it might be obvious that roads revolutionize everything they touch, in fact, we have quite conflicting evidence on the role of roads in the process of development, or of transportation infrastructure more broadly. For one thing, most of the evidence that we do have comes from what's generally called trunk infrastructure. So this is highways and railroads, big pieces of infrastructure that connect kind of distant regions and allow for the movement of goods over very long distances. We understand very little about rural roads, despite the fact that the majority of India's population by far lives in rural areas and may not benefit from transportation investments that don't touch those areas. But also just to touch on the conflicting evidence for a second, because I'm not going to spend too much time doing a lit review or anything else in this presentation. Basically from what we see from highways and from railroads, generally the papers do find that there are sort of large economic effects. Obviously, part of that is publication bias. Something that doesn't find much of an effect isn't going to really reach our attention. But actually the evidence that's found is quite conflicting. So you see evidence from India, from the Golden Quadrilateral, that suggests that actually highways allow for a decentralization of economic activity. That now that the GQ goes through parts of rural Rajasthan, I can now locate a factory in rural Rajasthan that serves markets in Delhi and Bombay, where I couldn't have previously because the transportation cost would have been too high. Okay. On the other hand, from evidence in China, actually from a very similar highway program, suggests quite the opposite, that actually highways going through areas lead to an emptying out of economic activity in these areas, that actually a greater concentration of business ends up in the cities, and sort of less ends up in these rural areas in between. I also want to say that, generally the work that's done on infrastructure is going to miss the vast majority of the impact. Almost every identification strategy, empirical strategy when it comes to railroads or highways, says these just happen to go through areas that weren't the sort of driving reason for why they were constructed. They were constructed to connect cities. They ran through these rural areas, and we're going to look at the rural areas that they happened to go through that were convenient to build a road through, and compare them to some rural areas that weren't. We think the first order effects are actually on the cities themselves, and we continue not to really have any evidence of that, and I'm not going to suggest that my paper really adds to that at all, but I do want to kind of flag that for any of you guys who are thinking of working on these things. Okay, so conflicting evidence, almost all on trunk infrastructure. Also, India has invested enormously in roads, both at that level as well as rural roads, over the last 20 years. So between 1991 and 2011, the share of villages with paved roads has gone up from just around a third to over half. Now, that's enormous progress. It also says that there's a lot of work to be done. The southern states have almost 80%, most states have over 80% of their villages connected by a paved road to the outside world, but that still leaves 20% even there, and in the northern states it's often below half. So the state of rural transportation infrastructure in India, there's still a lot to be done. Okay, that said, I don't want to set you up for expecting an impact evaluation here. What I'm doing here is not going to say you build a road and I'm going to go into depth on 1,000 different things that change when you build a road into a village. I'll give you a bunch of different outcomes, but fundamentally, actually, this paper is asking a somewhat different question. We start with this big question, old question in development economics. Why do so many people in low-income countries work in agriculture? Okay? Why are we surprised by this? There are basically two reasons. One, there are a lot of people working in agriculture. Two, they're really low productivity. Okay? And a lot of work has been done, particularly recently, demonstrating what's called the agricultural productivity gap. What this means is that the same people working in agriculture are much less productive than those same people if they went and took a job in a non-agricultural sector of the economy. Okay? So this is not about skills or about other things that might change the productivity of people when they work in one sector or another. And poor countries generally have both the largest number of people working in agriculture, the largest share of the workforce in agriculture, but also the largest gaps. The largest gaps in productivity between agriculture and the non-agricultural sector. So we think, therefore, that there's a lot of productivity to be gained from reallocation of labor out of agriculture and into the non-agricultural sector. And this isn't just sort of like economists are excited about gains to productivity, it's also that the same people would make a lot more money. These same poor people working in agriculture would make much, much more money if they moved to a different sector of the economy. So in India, the estimates are that low-skilled workers would make 2 to 3 times as much. Their wages would be 2 to 3 times higher if they were working in the non-agricultural economy than working in the agricultural economy. And yet, 50% of India's workforce is in fact in agriculture. And so this leaves a lot of gains that we think are being left on the table. Now, obviously, there must be some good reasons for why people are staying in agriculture, and that's part of what we're going to explore in this paper. This is just a graph showing that as countries get richer, far fewer people work in agriculture. In the United States, the agricultural employment share is 1.5%. And this is despite the fact that agriculture in the US is hugely productive. So you might think that a lot more people would be willing to work in such a productive sector, but in fact, only 1.5% of the people do. When you look across India, so this is a heat map showing the share of the workforce in agriculture. This is generated from the socioeconomic and caste census that we're going to use for a bunch of the outcomes in this paper. And so lighter shaded districts are those with a smaller share of the workforce in agriculture. The darker ones are where basically over half of the workforce is in agriculture. And what you see is that, the high agricultural productivity areas in India's northwest have both very high agricultural employment share districts and low agricultural employment share districts. And the same goes basically around the country. There aren't super strong patterns here that would suggest that it's agricultural productivity that's driving how many people actually work in that sector. Okay, so the hypothesis in this paper is that the poor state of rural transportation infrastructure is actually what's preventing people from taking higher productivity, higher wage jobs in other sectors of the economy. that if we're surprised that they're not arbitraging this gap, that they're not going and taking something higher paid, it's that there has to be some friction that's preventing them from doing that that's kind of larger in some way than the gains that they would make from reallocating, right? And what I'm arguing is that the state of rural transportation infrastructure that is really kind of upping those frictions. This is a big deal around the world. It's not just India. Over 1 billion people, according to one estimate from the World Bank, lack access to a paved road. And I would argue that actually that number is probably too low. Because by that number, you just need to be within about 3 kilometers of a paved road. But arguably being a few kilometers away from a paved road, you're not getting a lot of the benefits of that paved road. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to estimate the labor market effects of the largest rural road construction program in history. This is the PMGSY. PMGSY is the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana. It's the Prime Minister's Village Road Program. It's built hundreds of thousands of roads over the past 15 years or so. I'll talk more about it in a second. The impact is actually theoretically ambiguous. It's not obvious that you build roads into villages and people are going to get out of agriculture. So in sort of trade economics 101, we think that as you lower transportation costs, that people or places are going to move towards their comparative advantage. Right? The village no longer has to kind of produce everything for itself as it moves out of autarky. It can now trade more, and so it can specialize in whatever it's most productive in. And there are a lot of good reasons to think that what a village is going to be most productive in is actually agriculture. Villages are precisely places where land is abundant, as opposed to urban areas. And land being the dominant input into agriculture, very good reason to think that actually ag is the thing that's productive to do in villages. That said, it may be that it goes the other direction, and I'll show you that it does. It may also be that there's no effect whatsoever, right? It may be that you build a road into a village, and there are all these other binding constraints on the ability of people to move across sectors of the economy. It could be skills, it could be electricity, it could be regulations, you name it. All the things that economists and others are constantly talking about when it comes to India's economy. It may be that just alleviating one among the many, many constraints faced by producers in rural areas doesn't do enough to particularly change the structure of the economy. Okay. So to motivate things, let me just start with a quite simple graph. So on the x-axis, we have the straight line distance between a village and the nearest city. So here we're defining big city as a city of 500,000 plus population, but the graph looks basically the same even if you consider smaller cities as well. And on the y-axis, we have the share of households in the village that are reporting agriculture as their main source of income. So I think there are two things that are kind of striking about this graph. So on the one hand, both curves, the blue curve is for villages that don't have roads as of 2001, and the red curve is for villages that do have roads as of 2001. Two things are kind of striking. One is that share goes down sharply as you get closer and closer to cities. Okay? So the closer a village is to urban economies, the fewer people work in agriculture. The second is that having a road is sort of like the equivalent of being about 10 kilometers closer to the city. Right? That basically the curve just shifts down. So we're going to face two big challenges in this paper. And the reason why there's very little work, I think, on rural roads out there more generally. The first and I think biggest one is that road placement is endogenous. That roads get built into the areas that are most politically favored, that show the most economic promise, and so on. Often roads go into exactly the same areas where governance is high enough to deliver the roads in the first place, and therefore those same villages are more likely to be electrified, they're more likely to have a health center, and so on and so forth. And so it becomes very difficult to disentangle the impact of the road from all of those other things that are correlated with it. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to take advantage of rules in the PMGSY program that allocate the roads to certain villages. Certain villages get priority over other villages. I'll describe that in more detail in a minute. But basically what we're going to see is very, very similar villages that have very different prioritization in the PMGSY program and therefore that get different numbers of roads. And so we're going to use that as our identification strategy to try to get at the causal impact of rural roads. The second is data availability. So most studies out there, whether it's actually on highways or rural roads, say in India, they'll use the NSS, they'll use the Annual Survey of Industries, and so on. All of these data sets are going to be at the district level or higher. And so it becomes very difficult to measure exactly what's going on in these villages at the level of actual treatment. In this case, the level of treatment is the village. Either the village is getting a road or it's not. And so for that, we're going to use the SECC microdata. Over the last few years, we've sort of reconstructed the SECC data set, and I'll go into detail on that as well. But what this does is it gives us microdata on every single household and individual in rural India, at least if everything went according to plan. Okay, and to give a preview of results, basically a road gets built into a village and you see about a 10 percentage point decrease in the share of the workforce in agriculture. Okay, that's about equivalent of about a quarter or just under a quarter of the total number of workers working in agriculture. It's going from just under 50% to 10 percentage points lower.
Just a point of information.
Yeah.
How does the spatial dispersion of your threshold villages look as compared to like villages in India?
So we're going to be focusing around. Let me get to the threshold in a minute because you know more about the thresholds than other people do. So let me answer that in a second when I talk about the program rules. And if I haven't answered the question to your satisfaction, we'll come back to it. Right? Okay. So we see this big decrease in the share of the workforce in agriculture. We see an increase in earnings and in some assets. But when we get to that slide, I want to emphasize that really this does not represent this revolution in the village. It's not like all of a sudden everyone moves out of poverty or anything else. This impact is very strongly decreasing in distance to large cities. And so basically we don't estimate any effects for villages that are very far away from urban areas. Within village, we see a lot of heterogeneity. These effects are driven by men. They're driven by households with small land holdings, as well as low-caste households. Okay, but we actually don't find differences on age. And I'll discuss why we think this is going on in a little bit. And then finally, all of the evidence that we have points towards the mechanism being increased access to external, likely urban labor markets. That basically the story is about people living rural and working outside the village, working in more urban settings where the wages are higher. I'll present a bunch of pieces of evidence for that. Okay, well, what's this program? This was started in 2000 by India One to connect all villages to the road network. It's actually, the goal is to connect all habitations to the road network. Habitations are sub-villages. I'll be talking about villages here just because my data comes in at the village level, and so I can only really talk about villages. But let me be clear that the program itself talks about habitations because villages can have different clusters of population in different parts of the village space. By 2015, we see over 100,000 roads constructed, over 400,000 kilometers of road, over 100,000 previously unconnected villages benefited. So if you, this is sort of cutting in almost half the number of villages that don't have paved road access, if you trust kind of the PMGSY numbers. The census suggests something a little bit different. And this is nearly $40 billion dispersed. And this is actually more money is going to this than to the Golden Quadrilateral projects. They end up getting a lot more attention by both researchers and actually the news. So the way it works is it was funded centrally, but it was administered by the states. And you have all these different rules that go into determining the prioritization of villages, but it's really up to the states to kind of apply these rules. It is a federal system, and so as with so many other programs, it ends up looking quite different state to state. That'll be somewhat important for us. And very importantly for researchers, there's this very transparent and systematic record-keeping system. Okay, they put absolutely everything online. You can get data on every single road, what habitations it went to, where, how much money was spent, who the contractor was, and so on. And obviously that system is only as good as the information that's being put into the system. So, but it means that we can get information, at least according to the program, on every single road that's constructed. Also very, very important for us, and this is what we were just talking about a second ago, is that there are these objective eligibility rules. And so this says that large villages are supposed to be prioritized over small villages. This is true with many, many programs around India. But the PMGSY rules in particular said, okay, you're going to prioritize villages above 1,000 population first, then villages in the 500 to 999 category, then 250 to 499, and so on. And what's important about this is it's going to create these jumps at these population thresholds in the likelihood that a village is going to get a road. Okay? And where that's so important for the researchers is that basically comparing villages at 499 to villages at 501, you have very different likelihoods of getting a road, but we think they're the same in basically every way. In fact, we can show that in 2001 at baseline, before this program comes in, that these villages didn't look different at all. And it's only by 2012, when we're measuring outcomes after this program, that these villages start to diverge. Okay? That's basically the paper in a nutshell. To be clear about what these roads are and are not, these are paved all-weather roads. One of my favorite policy euphemisms, I think, is that in India, roads that are not passable during the monsoon are called fair weather roads. That they sort of abandon you in your time of worst need. I think that's exactly right. And so the goal here is really that these are paved all-weather roads. That doesn't just mean that they're paved. It means that they're passable at all times of year. It means that drainage is enormously important. You go around rural India and you can find roads paved and unpaved that basically where drainage hasn't been invested in, and so the rains come along and they're totally impassable, right? And so PMGSY has very, very strict criteria that are supposed to be applied around the country in terms of how culverts are built, how drainage ditches are constructed, and so on and so forth. So these roads really do stay passable at all times of the year. Since the goal is to connect these villages or habitations to the larger road network, the Indian government decided that the kind of cheapest way of doing this is to build what are called link roads. Okay, this is in contrast to through roads. So a link road just is basically a cul-de-sac that just goes up to the village itself. Basically, just think of here's a road going by, here's the village. We can just connect the two, and that's it. Okay. And so that's here when we say the village is the terminus in 71% of the cases, this is what we mean. It's just a short road connecting the village to whatever the closest town or larger road is. These are not major arteries to other places. Pardon?
That does not mean it is road connecting a single village.
It does not mean that it's a road connecting a single village, though oftentimes it is. Oftentimes it is. 71% of the time it actually is.
So I'm saying, if you say village is the terminus,
Yeah.
do you mean it's road connecting a single village, or
Yes, because otherwise it wouldn't be
that's
considered.
your definition of it?
Yeah, that's from this 71%. It's saying that it's the only one getting hit here. Yeah. Though there are the PMGSY does all of these multi-village roads as well. So the longer ones are going to go from one village to another to another to another. Okay. So this is what we call the first stage. So this is what's showing how does the probability of getting a road by 2012 change as you cross these population thresholds. So on the left, I've normalized population. So on the left are all villages that have below either that are close to but below 500 or 1,000 population in the states that follow the rules. Okay, there are many states. Interestingly, the states in North India tended to follow the population rules. The states in South India tended not to follow the population rules. Okay, so this particular study is going to be done on the states in North India that have relatively high percentages of villages that don't have roads at baseline and that did follow these population rules. So what you see is that you cross that threshold. As you cross either 500 or 1,000, you get about a 15 percentage point bump in your likelihood of getting a road under the PMGSY by 2012. Okay, and it goes from about almost 30% to almost 45%. So what's striking here is that A, at least in these states, the rules were followed. B, a lot of villages that were supposed to be lower priority didn't get roads by 2012. And C, a lot of villages that were more prioritized still didn't get roads by 2012, right? This graph is showing all of these things. And so what we're going to do, the empirical strategy that we use, effectively comparing on either side of these cutoffs, it's called a fuzzy regression discontinuity. The regression discontinuity comes from this change in the likelihood of treatment right at the cutoff. The fuzziness comes from the fact that you're not going from having a 0 probability of getting the road to having a probability of 1 of getting the road. You're getting this 15 percentage point increase.
What are the dots?
What are the
States?
Sorry?
Dot states? What are they?
Oh, so the dots are bins of population. So
Oh, this
it's
is population.
collections of villages. It's 100-something villages, and this is the average probability of getting a road, right? Because it's either 0 or 1.
Yeah,
the
right,
village
right.
either got a road or it didn't. So the y-axis is capturing the share of villages in each population bin that did get a road by 2012.
Good question.
Yeah.
Since normalized population is in 2011, you said, right?
No, so the population, let me be clear on that, thank you. The population is determined in 2001.
Right.
Okay, so the population has to be determined at baseline. The PMGSY program, in order to determine eligibility, was supposed to use the 2001 population census. And so these are village populations in the 2001 population census. I'll show you some results using the 2011, and interestingly, those don't change. So that actually is one of the ways that we use to reject migration being a major story here. Okay. But yeah, you can't use the 2011 because that's sort of an outcome in some sense. You need to use something at baseline. It's also very important that you don't use the actual program populations. So I've taken it out of this presentation, but in my class for my Oxford students on regression discontinuity, I show them exactly what you don't want to see is basically evidence of manipulation. What we see here is huge evidence of manipulation in the official program records. Basically, in the official program, villages are much more likely to have a population of 501 than they are to have a population of 499. In the census, that's not true. The distribution is totally smooth. But in the program records, it's really, really striking. And I think that's worth flagging because I think that a lot of times when research is done on programs like this, we kind of take their data at face value. And I think it's enormously important to check it and to, in fact, use other data sources, particularly when it's coming down to actual identification. Okay? All right, so here's really the summary of the paper pictorially. Here we have two villages in northeast Rajasthan. Chori Kanangla has a population of 514, has a primary school, no health center, and is electrified. This is all according to 2001 population census. And the vast majority of people, 93%, are working in agriculture. Again, according to the census. Mundia is a village just a few kilometers to the south. It has also a primary school, no health center, and is electrified, but its population, 496, falls just under the population cutoff that determines PMGSY eligibility. Fast forward to 2012, the Chori Kanangla has gotten a road in 2007. Agricultural employment has fallen dramatically. Mundia did not get a road. Agricultural employment fell much, much less quickly. That's basically the paper, okay? I handpicked these results. This is a very nice, convenient example. You can find some other villages where it didn't happen so much, but basically the paper is going to show you, on average, this is what's happening. Not quite so dramatically.
Can I renew my question
Yes,
about
now-
spatial distribution of threshold villages?
Yeah.
So
The spatial distribution of...
threshold villages, do they look pretty much like villages all over India?
So there are two ways to interpret that question. One is, okay, you're saying, do the villages that we include in our sample, which are basically villages close to 500 and 1,000, are they fairly similar to the rest of the distribution of villages in India? So, no, yes and no. The no is that, first of all villages in our sample are sort of the remaining third or half of villages, depending on how you define it, in India that don't have roads at baseline. Right? So first and foremost, we're estimating these effects on sort of like the poorer villages in India, and particularly this is concentrated in North India, right? And the second, and all the correlates of not having a road in 2001, they're going to be different in those ways. The second is, are villages at the 500 and 1,000 population thresholds kind of different in some way from villages of other sizes? Because, yeah, smaller villages are in fact different. They're less likely to have all kinds of infrastructure and other things. I will say the average village size in India is 1,000, so it's actually kind of, in 2001, so it's actually kind of nice in a way. Our 1,000 sample is picking up exactly the average village. I'm not going to show you any results on the difference between our results for 500 and 1,000, because generally in our specifications we pool for power. Basically, we don't really see much differences between them. And so we don't think that sort of village size is an important determinant of at least the effects that we're seeing here.
And spatial distribution looks kind of similar? Like your thresholds didn't sort of... Because, there are places with higher population density, lower population density, and it's going to change distributions of the...
No, that's exactly right. So I have a different paper that we're working on right now that shows how much worse things get when you move away from cities. That basically, when you compare villages that are closer to cities, and then as you get further and further away from them, things get worse in almost every dimension. And it's not just economically. So this is a nice opportunity to pitch that paper for a second, and especially since hopefully we'll have time for discussion, and I'd love to hear thoughts on that since so many people work on urbanization here. What we find in that paper is that not only do economic indicators of poverty and income and whatever else get worse as you move away from cities, but actual state capacity gets worse as well. That your likelihood of being electrified, that your likelihood of having a secondary school, or you name it, all of these things go down, and that includes roads. Okay? So basically, our sample is more skewed towards remote areas than the average, because the average village very close to a city is much more likely to have a paved road than the average village further away from the city. Okay? So in that sense, it's a little bit non-representative. That said, we're going to cut up and show you results based on distance from city, and that's just within this sampling. So
your city numbers, previous ones that you showed were profile, centroid. Do you really have this network? I mean, can you actually do distances by actual road travel distance?
yeah, basically no, but we're working on it. So we use Google Maps to basically calculate travel distances between every pair of district headquarters in the country, and we also did that between every town within district. Okay? That you can do because Google basically knows about the larger roads. What Google doesn't know about, and what's very hard to characterize, is the entire rural road network. What we're using here, basically we're not doing a network analysis because we don't know the rural road network. And so all we're doing is saying, did a village get a road by 2012 or not? We're really not taking advantage of any of that sort of richness. You can calculate measures of sort of travel times from villages to various places, but you have to assume something about that sort of final mile. Basically, from the village to whatever the nearest town is that they would be traveling to. Right? And so that has to be straight line distance.
The way you organize data, because the PMGSY data gives you link by link, right? So it isn't organized in the network sense. I mean, forget the geography.
Yeah, forget the mountains or whatever. Yeah.
Just simply that X is connected to Y and Y is connected to Z and Z is connected to P. Is that, is your data organized in a way that one can build those relationships?
Not currently. It's something that we could work on more in the future. Let me give you a short answer to this, and then we could take it offline later if we actually wanted to do some data work on that. The way the PMGSY data is organized is you have all of these different tables that are characterizing the sort of program activities in different ways, right? What we use for treatment is the data sets on every road that's built. It says what villages were hit by the road that was built. Okay? We then match that list of villages to our census data and every other village level data set that we have in that master panel that we've constructed. That's how we know what villages got treated and when and all that kind of stuff. There are other tables that kind of give a description of the road, and those generally say this road goes from National Highway 8 to this village, or something like that, right? And that's sort of, generally in that description, you have some characterization of the starting and end point. That said, the starting point isn't very good because it often just says some other road that I don't know what that road is, or I don't know where on National Highway 8 the rural road started or anything like that. Sometimes they do say from one village to another, in which case, or from one town to one village. Then you can actually characterize that, but they didn't set it up in such a way that's very nice for kind of like constructing out that network. It would take I tried to get, they put together these district rural road plans, which basically say, here are all the roads that exist, now here are the roads that we want to build. That would allow you to really have the entire network, and then to basically see the segments that get built over time. They do it all in basically in a form of CAD, which is fine for engineers kind of plotting these things out, but like converting that into some sort of usable GIS data, I think we could probably find a way of getting it done, but like at an ungodly cost and with huge amounts of time spent, which was never worth it to us. But when we started this project, we were hoping that we'd be able to do something kind of in a more sophisticated network way. This is another way of characterizing sort of villages. What I want to show here, so gray are non-priority villages, and red are priority villages. This is for MP. And the big brown lines show the highways, the blue diamonds show the cities of above 500,000 population. So what you'll usually see...
These are national highways, right?
These are big national highways.
Covering the state highways.
Was that? We're not covering the state highways right now. Exactly. Yeah. But all I'm trying to show here is that most of the time when you see research that's done on, say, highways or on roads more generally, they'll compare areas that are relatively close to the highways to areas that are relatively far away. Okay? We're doing a very, very different thing here. We're essentially comparing the red guys to the gray guys. And that means they're all over the place. And it means that they're very nearby. Right? When we throw in district fixed effects, or we...
On that, I don't see the red or green response.
You don't see red or gray?
Could you zoom it in?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, you can probably zoom it in. I'm not sure this slide is worthy of this much attention.
I know. I was gonna say.
But why not? Okay. So the point here is that basically the red and the gray guys are scattered all over the map. It's totally random, whether you happen to be just above the population threshold or just below. And this is what we're comparing. So unlike a lot of research that's comparing relatively far away areas, take the research on the Golden Quadrilateral. It has to compare districts that are like on the Golden Quadrilateral to districts that are quite far away. Those are going to be different in a lot of different ways, right? And actually, some research suggests that they've been different for quite a long time. It's not just that they've recently diverged. What we're really comparing here is really, really similar villages, really nearby villages that happen to get roads or not get roads because of these somewhat arbitrary rules. Okay. Just to give a sense, so this program starts in 2000. Not surprisingly, it takes a while to start building roads. Each bar contains the number of previously unconnected villages that got a road in that year. It's a little different from the number of roads that are built. It's the number of villages that are getting connectivity. And basically, the PMGSY program starts in 2000. We have all this baseline data in 2001, including the village populations. For the first few years, about 5,000 or 6,000 roads per year are getting built. After 2007, it picks up to over 10,000 villages per year are getting connected. And basically, we're going to measure a bunch of outcomes in either 2011 or 2012. On average, the roads are built for the villages in our sample in 2008. So sort of the average effect that we're estimating is about a 3-year effect. Okay? And that's one of the limitations of this study, is that we can't tell you, A, what are the differences between roads that are sort of built earlier and late, because those aren't happening in comparable villages, and B, there are reasons to think that some of the effects are going to take some time. And we're not in a very strong position to measure this, because we have our data in this period, right? And we're really taking advantage of villages that didn't get roads by 2012. All these villages are eventually going to get roads under PMGSY if everything goes according to plan. So we really are never going to be able, from this program at least, to look at the long-run impacts of such investments. Okay. So I've said a lot of these things before, but I think it's worth repeating because this is the empirical heart of the paper. Our identification is going to come from these discontinuities in treatment probability. And so the technique is called regression discontinuity. It's a fuzzy regression discontinuity because this jump in probability is a 15 percentage point jump. And so essentially, this is an instrumental variable strategy. We're instrumenting for treatment with this dummy for RU to the right of the population threshold. And we limit our sample to villages relatively close to this population threshold in order to have comparable villages on the other side. Now, we're going to, because it's sort of unclear, the PMGSY did a certain amount of upgradation. You actually see quite a few villages that were recorded as having roads at baseline that got roads anyway, even though they weren't supposed to be prioritized. So we're going to throw out all the villages that had a road at baseline. We really want to focus on what happens to a village when it gets a paved road where it didn't have one before. It's a little harder to interpret what it means when it's kind of getting resurfaced or something like that. This is the local average treatment effect for compliers. Compliers mean for that set of villages where crossing the threshold from just under 500 to just over is enough to go from not getting a road to getting a road. Right? This is just our version of the local average treatment effect that you have in all instrumental variables approaches. So it's really saying there's some complier set that is moved by the instrument. Those are the guys that we're estimating for. So we're not estimating the effect of a road on villages that are so politically favored that even if they're small, they get a road under PMGSY. We're also not estimating the effect for villages that are so unfavored that they never get a road. This is precisely that group for whom the threshold is enough to move them into getting a road. We're going to aggregate all data to the village level, as I already explained, because no other data set in India uses habitations in any way, other than the water ministry for one thing, which we're not using here. And we're going to pool the cutoffs. We're going to put together the cutoffs at 500 and 1,000 in order to basically double our sample size and have a lot more power. When we look at the results disaggregated, they look basically the same. All right, so this is our specification. We're going to regress whatever the outcome is. I'll describe the main one in a second. On a constant on this dummy for whether you got a new road, that's what's instrumented for with are you to the right or the left of the population threshold. Controlling linearly for population on either side of the cutoff. A set of village level controls, as well as district fixed effects. Okay? So this is important because this is what says we are really comparing villages within the same districts that do or don't get roads. This is not about comparing areas in Bihar which didn't construct many roads to areas in Andhra which did construct a lot of roads. Okay. We also use, there it is, the optimal bandwidth. I think for anyone who's doing regression discontinuity, it's now kind of standard you have to calculate an optimal bandwidth, which basically says how close to the cutoff do you keep observations. And so in this case, you can calculate it a bunch of different ways. There's an econometric literature on how to go about doing this, but basically we keep villages that are within 85 population of the cutoff. So basically around 1,000 cutoff, we're keeping villages between 915 and 1,085. Okay, that's what's defined as relatively close to the cutoff. So in order to ensure that this is actually a valid design, we need to establish that a number of things are the case. So bullet point number 2 says that there's a strong discontinuity in the probability of treatment as you cross these population thresholds. That's what I already showed you. That's that 15 percentage point jump. Sure.
Understand it right? Villages with population of less than 915 in one group.
Less than 915 are getting thrown out of our sample.
Right. And so there's a top in matter. There's 1085 matter.
What do you mean? So we throw out everything. We only keep villages in that window, right? So we're throwing out everything with population above 1,085, everything below 915 until you get down to the 500 group, and then again we're keeping villages between 415 and 585.
But there's no other spatial matching beyond that, right? There's no how close they are as a way of throwing in and out.
Oh no, we're not creating matched pairs here.
Yeah.
We're not doing anything like that. You could.
Yeah.
But we're not doing anything like that. It's just basically comparing on either side of these cutoffs. The district fixed effects we're actually doing district cutoff fixed effects. So essentially we're comparing villages of roughly the same size that fall on either side of these population cutoffs within the same districts.
So
Was that answering your question, Mark?
how many do you get?
We end up with about 19,000 in our main sample, I think. So remember, it's in the states that follow the rules. It's around these two population cutoffs within villages that did not, at baseline in 2000, have paved roads. So you end up losing a lot of sample, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we have 600,000 villages in India. We're keeping a tiny share of it.
Optimal bandwidth, what are you optimizing?
There are different papers and sort of methods that go about it in a different way. Essentially, you want to trade off power. So, the perfect thing in some sense is comparing villages that have 499 population to 500, and that's it. Those are the guys that are most similar, right? The problem is that you don't have very many villages who have literally those exact populations. And so you're kind of trading off getting villages that are slightly less similar as you move further away with the need for power in order to actually estimate your effects. And that's essentially what these optimal bandwidth calculations do. They trade off those things in slightly different ways. Now, one of the ways that we actually, the bandwidth matters a little bit less for us, and people often do this, is we actually weight our observations using a triangular kernel, moving away from the cutoff. So that means that the observations that get the most weight are those that do have 499 and 500 population. And even though we're including those other observations because it's important for power and having more observations, actually as you get further away, you put less emphasis, you put less weighting in your regressions on those villages. Sorry?
The weights differ a lot in the column very sharply.
It's triangular, so it's linear. So it's linear decline. So you have
how high is the triangle?
Oh, right. It basically it
sharper the
no. It starts as you have weighting of 1 as you're right on the cutoff, and you have weighting of 0 as you get to 85, and you just go down like that. Yeah. But sorry. So yeah, your question is it starts at 1. It doesn't start at 100. But it would be the same actually with linear, right? Yeah. So let's take that offline if we want to discuss further. But with linear, it wouldn't matter how you scale the weighting. We see no discontinuity in the density of the running variable at the threshold. This is what's often referred to as a McCrary test. Okay, so here you want to show that there's no evidence of manipulation. That basically there is as many villages just to the left of the cutoff as there are just to the right of the cutoff. And this is exactly what I said is violated in the PMGSY administrative data, but is not violated in the census data that we use. And so we just throw out the PMGSY administrative data. We don't even try to correct it or anything else. We just don't use it because we know that it's manipulated. You also want to see that there's balance in baseline covariance, that basically at the beginning of this program, the villages on either side of these cutoffs look the same, and it's only after the program has been around for 10 years that these villages actually look different. We do 2 other things here that I think are important, though aren't often done in papers like this. One is that we establish the absence of other programs using the cutoff. Usually, papers you say we don't find any other programs or that use the cutoff, or no programs that are particularly relevant. That's it. We actually do find one program that follows the 1,000 cutoff, and that's the Total Sanitation Campaign that encouraged villages to build toilets. When we actually look in the census data at is there a discontinuity in the likelihood of having toilets or participating in the campaign or anything else, we find no evidence for that. So basically, they didn't follow the rules, which is at least that particular rule, which is. What's that?
They didn't follow the rules.
Hey, I know. The great thing about this paper is the only reason we can do it is because somebody actually followed the rules. All right.
That's the big
It turns out,
surprise.
yeah. Maybe that should be the argument in the paper. Some states follow some rules sometimes. Should be the title of the paper. Yeah. Anyway, so TSC didn't follow the rules, so we're not really worried that the differences we find are actually being driven by toilets. Not that we'd be worried that they were driven by toilets anyway. But I don't even think Dean Spears would think that toilets would drive 10% of the population to get out of agriculture. I haven't asked him.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, of course.
So you made what would be empirically a strong claim by saying district fixed effects are sort of accounting for what the differences in these villages should be spatially, in some sense, right? So
District
one,
cutoff,
one of the things that I don't know enough about how this program is administered, but one might think that villages that are close to each other that were near the threshold may have had different probabilities of getting roads. Meaning, what's a control village might still have had a higher probability of getting a road had it been spatially closer. Like there's something going on within the district. It's not purely something that's being decided at the district. So do you have I don't care about the map thing. Do you have a policy reason why the district is the right level at which to do this, as opposed to like just things that are closer?
No. I mean, so we can even run this. It takes like a day, but you can run it with sub-district fixed effects too. There are just a lot more of them. You know, given the sheer size of our data set and all the control variables and everything else, throwing in more and more fixed effects takes much, much longer. So there's nothing magical about district. You can run it with sub-district fixed effects. I want to address...
Because it changes the fuzzy part of it, right? It changes the complier rate, potentially.
But it doesn't.
Yeah, that's my question.
So empirically it doesn't. So if you look at the first stage regressions in the paper, they don't change when you throw in different controls and so on and so forth. That 15% jump is sort of determined by the sample overall and doesn't change a lot.
You can see Avani, our state is a way more inclusive state than
Just by virtue of being non-functional.
What's this?
My state is more inclusive than we think it is.
Right. By neglecting people.
By virtue of being non-functional.
Yeah.
Just one word.
Yeah. One other thing that we do check. So this is the first paper that, in any big way, is using the SECC. the SCCC, in fact, wasn't made publicly available in this form, right? And I'm about to get to why we're actually able to work with it. So the other thing that was important for us to do was to actually check the data quality. What we're not establishing here is that the data is perfect. It's, I'm sure, far from perfect. And I bet that people in this room know a lot more about all of its imperfections than I do. What we establish here is that in treatment and control villages, we don't see particular differences in data quality. Okay? And that's what's important here, because it is certainly possible that a road actually changes the quality of the data that is able to be gotten, and therefore, any sort of differences that we observe 10 years down the line after a road has been built, we have to be concerned that maybe it's actually being driven by data quality rather than by actual facts on the ground. And so what we do here is we compare the SCCC to the census. They have a number of different variables that are basically the same. And so we measure those two things at the village level. We create a difference between the SCCC and the village, and we basically regress our treatment on those differences. We regress those differences on our treatment. So basically to see, is our treatment affecting the distance between the census and SCCC measures of the same things? And we don't find differences there. Okay? So it's relatively rare that you're actually in a strong position to do that. Usually you just have one data set that you can use to measure outcomes. Here we have a couple, at least for a few things. And so we're able to show that those don't vary systematically with the road.
There's no systematic, any measurement errors in the SCCC are nicely spherically distributed.
I'm saying that they appear to be uncorrelated with our treatment. Yeah.
As far as
Yeah.
this thing is concerned, it's all shut in
Yeah.
the other term.
Yeah, as far as this is concerned, exactly. Once we've added in all of our district fixed effects and everything else, right? I mean, I'm sure that the errors are going to be different from one state to another and all kinds of stuff like that, but what matters for the purposes of this study is whether they're correlated at the end of the day with that sort of area. Exactly. Okay. So here we establish the running density smoothness, and we show that the distribution doesn't change around the cutoffs. Here we show that baseline covariates are the same as you cross the threshold. These are from 2001 population census. Let me get to the data. Basically, we use administrative data to describe treatment. We use GIS data to know where these villages are and where the towns are, because we're going to make use of those distances to cities. We have the population census from 91, 2001, 2011, which both provide us with controls, as well as a few outcomes that we can actually measure in the 2011 population census. The economic census, which unfortunately the 2012 hasn't come out yet, but will, I think, soon come out, and will be a part of this paper when it does. We have 98 in 2005, and so we end up using that to try to look at non-farm employment within the village, and is that changing with PMGSY road construction in the first few years of the program by 2005. But really the main part of this paper is about using the SCCC, and so let me describe that in more detail. So, as you guys probably know, the SCCC was launched in 2011, done mostly in 2012, and then some updating happened a bit after, to determine eligibility and means-tested programs. This is for rural India. We have urban data as well, but we don't use it in this paper. 825 million observations, 166 million households, 600,000 villages. We're not going to use this at the individual level. We're going to aggregate these things up to the village level because that's where treatment is. Village either gets treated or not. It's not that a household either gets treated or not, right? So those aren't independent observations. It's really basic demographic and economic data. At the household level, we know what assets the household has, their income in this terribly determined variable, land holdings, and agricultural equipment. I'll get to that in a second. At the individual level, we have education, occupation. Occupation was actually written in free form. We have about 250,000 different occupational words that were written there. I could have described myself as an economist, as a researcher, as a dilettante, anything. We have age, gender, and disability. We know exactly where they are because they use the census definition. So we have.
You actually digitize those two.
Yeah. We're going to use that for this. I'll describe that in a sec. We because they use the 2011 population census, we know where all these people and households are. So basically, the government put them up online, and and you guys have seen this website, right? Yeah. So the government put them up online, and over the last 3 years, we've been pulling them down. And we ended up verifying them by comparing them to the census and the NSS. But let me just go through this process, since this is a geeky audience. Let me geek out for a second on how we actually put this together. So the government posted these PDFs online of both the draft and the final lists for 82 days at a time in the interest of transparency. They also pasted them to the side of panchayat buildings and so on and so forth, right? And part of the SECC was that they're supposed to be reviewed, and then there were Gram Sabha meetings that decided on whether the data was accurate or not, and there were appeals and all that kind of thing. So they were posted in this format. This is from one of the Hindi states, from Rajasthan. And so we blocked out the names. They actually list the names of everybody. We've completely sequestered that. We're not using it at all. But that's what it looks like for a household. So there are the 3 members of the household, and then below, to the side of them are all of their individual information, and then below is all of their household information. So we pulled these down. It's actually closer to 3 years now. That gives us about 8 terabytes of PDFs. And every once in a while, the government liked to mess with us and throw in some Excel files. There are a few Excel files thrown in there too. It would have been nice if they had done all of them in Excel, but they didn't. So we then had to parse it. We had to write our own software in order to actually extract the data from these PDFs. As you might imagine from government-generated PDFs, they're a total mess. And so we had to extract all the data from them.
You can become really rich.
Yeah.
Because all of us have that problem. So if you know how to solve it, you start selling.
Extracting data out of... I don't think you guys are...
No, it's a problem-specific solution, right?
Oh,
it's
so
a problem.
it's not generic to all.
I know, because I went to him for my problem, and no.
Yeah.
I almost made you rich.
Yeah. I'm just waiting for him to have more money before I...
Exactly.
Yeah, I don't think...
You're going to be waiting a long time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we had to do it very specifically tailored to this. There is software out there that allows you to extract text from PDFs. I've used it for nicely formatted PDFs. So, for example, like the Election Commission puts out really nice PDFs with all of the electoral data on turnout and that kind of thing. That, we used really standard off-the-shelf software. It works beautifully. You clean it up a little bit in Stata and you're all good. This is a total nightmare. There are images embedded in this stuff, and there are all kinds of weird glyphs, and it was a mess. So we hired some machine learning PhD students. We wrote some of it ourselves in some combination of languages. And at the end of the day, we have this 600 gigabytes of CSV files of usable data. But it's not usable yet because it's in 13 different languages. And so we had to translate from 12 Indian non-English languages. We decided to make English our standard language for this. Translated from these other 12 alphabets. We did a combination of manual and Google translation. One of the really nice things is that actually Google now has quite competent translation engines for most Indian languages, for most major Indian languages. And these were done in the major Indian languages. And so we had over 250,000 unique words, the vast majority of which were these free-form written in occupations. But we're really interested in what people are doing, and so we put a lot of emphasis on getting this right.
Which 2 languages have the same script?
What's that?
Which 2 languages have the same alphabet?
No, I think English might be the last one.
Oh, so.
I think that's what we ended up saying. Like Bengali and Assamese were close, and using them, but they're not the same. And
they're off by 1 letter.
Yeah, exactly.
Which you can,
So anyway,
there's statehood based off of that 1 letter. So
I think what we're saying here is that we translated it all into English, and that it's the lemon left out. We did these various quality checks. We had to standardize the occupation. So what we did is we took the National Classification of Occupations, which was last done in 2004, and we standardized everything according to that. Okay? This is what's going to be important when we're talking about are people working in agriculture or not, what are they doing. So at the end of the day, we have 825 million individuals, 166 million households, 43 gigabytes of usable data. Martha.
One is your occupation, so what level of this here?
4-digit. I mean, so sorry. We matched at whatever level we could. So when someone says agricultural labor, I think that's a 2-digit. I think when someone said farmer, that was a 1-digit. That was digit 6, I think. But but then sometimes, you're talking about paneer technician or something, and that's a terrible example. But that's a 4-digit. I don't know. There was some fishery stuff that was super specific that allowed us to get down to lower levels, but or types of doctors and stuff like that. So that allows us to go much deeper. So basically, we match it whatever level we can. We like to get more depth. We often don't have that much depth.
One is that compared to the sense, is that a real difference to the senses?
We don't know what's in the census because the census gives us these 4 weird categories.
So I'm saying, compared to what you have in the census, or even what you had in the previous one, which was about 17 or 17, actually effectively about 9.
What was 9?
The previous census and even this census at some point in time, you get these 9-fold classifications.
I see.
At the village level, and district level, possibly go down to the village level. Right now, you're 2001, you have that in the district level? 9-fold? Yeah. I see them, whatever.
It's not the village level. The village level PCA.
Right.
Yeah.
So compared to that, that's one very large thing. So you have this, whatever level of NCU or so. I'm not trying to think of anything else. Is there anything else that I'm missing in terms of what you have as part of the SECC? Because the cast can also be very detailed, but what
we don't have that.
So
we don't have detailed caste and we don't have detailed religion here. But the PDFs that were put online do not have those 2 variables.
But do you have OBC?
No. SCST general.
SCST. Okay. So, is there anything else? In
Income,
assets,
income and land. Income and land, in theory.
Income, forget income. We don't. That's pointless. Yes.
I agree, but I have to show the results. I agree.
But what else is there in this
So you have land holding,
landholding? Yeah.
right? Which you don't have in the census. You can do an average land holding in the census because they say total cultivated land or something like that. But the census actually has more assets than you do here.
For a village, it has a lot more.
For a village, it has a lot more. No, I think what's really, we have the names, and so one could do a lot with that,
Yes.
but we're not touching that right now, right? The detailed occupations, the land holdings, the agricultural equipment is not in the census.
At the village level, you have, if I'm aggregating the village level, not the individual stuff, I would be able to get distribution of land holdings they don't have in the census.
Which you don't have in the census, exactly.
Since I could get an average land holding, here I would get a distribution.
Exactly. And most importantly, look, the really big thing here is that we have the microdata.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So you can give me averages of what share of households work in agriculture in the census, but I can tell you what share of SC 25-year-olds who don't own land are working in agriculture, right? So when we're talking about doing a study on villages and what's changing at the village level and who's doing what and whatever else, the census doesn't allow you to do any of that because the census collapses everything down to just a village average.
Yeah.
And that's it.
And refuses to give you a 1% sample like any other country. Right?
I thought there were those, like at the data centers and things, I thought that they had the microdata. Talk later.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the data. So all of that said, now we're going to look at some specific outcomes, right? That's everything we have, but let's talk about some very specific outcomes. And now, everyone who's been snoozing through all of this data geekery can come back. We have 2 major ways of measuring whether you're working in agriculture or working in some other sector of the economy. At the household level, they ask a question about your primary source of income. And it's either cultivation or manual labor or so on and so forth. And so we have the share of households in the village that are deriving their primary source of income from cultivation. That's one measure. Measure 2 is at the occupational level. Instead of being at the household level, this is at the individual level. This says, is the main occupation that you reported to us in agriculture? And so we had to categorize all of these different occupations as described, and now we're going to categorize what share of workers are actually in the agricultural sector. So that could be someone who says farmer, that could be someone who says I do field work, that could be someone who says I'm an agricultural laborer, and so on and so forth. Okay? Those are going to be the ways that we do it. And what's really important about these is that when we're telling this story that roads help people move across different sectors of the economy, we need to see that your actual occupation is shifting, right? It's certainly possible that your household source of income is shifting, but that's because wages went up in the non-agricultural sector following a road, but people aren't actually shifting what they're doing, right? That's interesting, but it's a very different story from roads facilitate people to get access to jobs elsewhere and so on and so forth. It's a very, very different story. It's a sort of price story rather than a reallocation story. Okay. So what do we see? We see this, we calculate this 10 percentage point decrease in the share of households in cultivation and an 11 percentage point increase in the share of households deriving their income from manual labor. What these graphs show, so sorry, this isn't very clear. On the left is the share of the households in cultivation. On the right is the share of households deriving their income from manual labor, right? And what we're interested in is there a structural break as you cross this population threshold, right? And so what you see here, if you pay attention to the numbers, is you see about a 0.015 or 1.5 percentage point decrease in the share of households in cultivation, and about that same thing when you cross the threshold increase in manual labor. Now that number is not the same as that. Because remember, only 15% of villages are getting roads, additional 15% of villages are getting roads as you cross that threshold, right? And so basically any differences that we see have to then be scaled by that probability difference in the share of villages getting roads. If it were going from 0 probability of getting a road to 1 probability 100% of getting a road, then this difference would be exactly our treatment effect. But it has to be scaled by the first stage, right? So essentially the estimated effect is the reduced form, that's what you see there, divided by the first stage. Okay. So here we compare the estimates that we get from looking at households to the estimates that we get from looking at occupations, individual workers. And so on the left are just basically the two estimates that I just told you about. A 10 percentage point decrease in cultivation and 11 percentage point increase in manual labor. What you see when you do the occupations is basically exactly the same. Slightly larger standard errors, but basically exactly the same. Okay, so this suggests that these differences in households reporting their income are not about changing wages across different sectors, but really about people moving their actual occupations. Okay. We don't see migration effects. Let me explain that. This is very hot in development economics right now. Melanie Morton and some other people are finding that you build roads into areas and a lot of people migrate out. Mushfiq Mubarak and others are showing that when you lower transportation costs of taking buses into the cities, then people go and get jobs in the cities and then they migrate out, right? We're not seeing those effects right now. Now, the way we're measuring migration is permanent migration. It's about what's your primary place of residence. And so it's not about how much time are you spending outside of the village or anything like that. It's also only a few years after the roads have been constructed. And so it's certainly possible that if you looked kind of down the line, that you see more people moving out over the long run. But we can test this based on changes in the population in these villages. We can also test this in the SECC microdata by actually looking at the age and gender distribution of the population. We know that young men are generally the first ones to move out for work, right? And so we can see, is there a different share of the population that are 25 to 30-year-old males in villages that got roads to villages that didn't. So we can be much more precise about kind of testing these ideas than just looking at the overall population as a whole, which kind of conflates in-migration, out-migration, mortality changes, fertility changes, and so on. So this allows us to get a lot more precise, and everything is consistent. We're just not finding changes. Okay, we can rule out even very small changes in migration. When it comes to economic outcomes, Parth already suggested that we shouldn't even believe these results. I'm sympathetic to that perspective. We see noisy gains to income and assets. We find gains to the probability that your house has a solid roof and walls. That's kind of reassuring because that's often the first thing that households upgrade when they get a little bit of money in rural areas. But we don't find an increase in other durable assets. They asked if you have a refrigerator, there's no change in the probability of that. They asked if you have a four-wheeler vehicle, no change in the probability of that. Even two-wheelers, we don't see a change in that in building a road on average of 3 years later.
Cell phones?
We don't even see cell phones. I mean, cell phone penetration is already very high in these villages by 2012, but we actually don't see a change in cell phones. That was one of the more surprising results I found. The cell phone data, if you look at the percentage of households that have cell phones in the SECC, I think it might be one of the most dubious variables. When you look at kind of like percentages crossing state boundaries, the cell phone numbers jump around state boundaries in ways that some of the others don't. And so it might be that it was either measured differently or people were reporting very differently in different places. Villages in Gujarat are generally richer than villages relatively close by in Rajasthan. This is the area of southern Rajasthan where I used to work. And their cell phone numbers are much lower than the Rajasthani numbers. So take it what you will. Maybe there's an effect and we're not picking it up. Maybe there's no effect at all. We do find some evidence that there's actually a change in the growth rate of the village. Now, not having annual data, we can't really say much about growth versus level effects, right? We just know that you didn't have a road at the beginning, you have a road at the end, and we're comparing villages on either side of that. But we're not in a very good position to look at on the sort of, is this a change in the rate or is this a one-time change in what's happening at the village? The only thing that we have at the annual level is nightlights. And I don't want to get in a big discussion of what nightlights are and how to interpret them and are they production versus consumption and all that, though I do find that interesting. All I can say is we do find some evidence that there's actually a change after building the road in the growth rate of nightlights. So it's not that there's like a big level jump and then it kind of stays the same but richer. It looks like there may actually be increasing effects over time. And so if that's the case, then our sort of average of 3-year estimates for what's going on in these villages may not be the same as the 10-year estimates.
Can you spell that out a bit more? What exactly do you do?
Yeah, so I don't have a link here. So there's no whiteboard, right? So what we did is instead of doing it in the RD, we take a panel specification where we have a measure of nightlight intensity at the village level for each year. And so we can calculate a growth rate, which is the log of nightlights from this year minus log of nightlights from last year. Okay? And we can regress that on did you have a road or not have a road. And basically what you see is in the years leading up to getting a PMGSY road, the growth rate of nightlights is basically pretty constant. And then there's kind of a jump up in that growth rate in the year following a road, and it kind of continues on that trajectory. So it's a jump up not in the intensity of nightlights, but in the year-to-year growth rate. Suggesting that every additional year that you've had a road, you're continuing to benefit from whatever it's bringing to your village. That said, there are a number of issues. The whole reason why we're not doing any of this stuff in that kind of specification is because we want to compare villages on either sides of these cutoffs, and those results actually don't suggest as big effects. And given the somewhat of an inconsistency between those two ways of measuring the effects, I'm not going to put this in the final
This
paper.
is not from the cutoff, this is from your temporal data.
Exactly. That's how we would calculate the growth rates. We wouldn't have it otherwise.
And you basically have like a 1 kilometer grid when you're looking at the GPS coordinate which is within the.
How big are the pixels in the nightlight there? Do you remember?
I don't remember. I think we end up, because we aggregated up the pixels a little bit to capture the approximate size of villages or something like that, so that it's not just the micropixel that we're...
Do you use some sort of buffer average?
Yeah, we use some, exactly. I think decreasing away from the dot, but I have to get back to you on that. Again, because I'm not going to... I put it in here because I think it's of interest, and I think that the question of whether investments like this or electrification or something else have a growth or level effect is, I think, a really important one for researchers. It's not one that we can do particularly well here, and so I'm mostly mentioning it because I think it's of interest, not because I think we're really nailing it down. Okay.
But do you pick up electrification?
No. So that's actually something that I was really struck by. So one of my interests in going into this paper was an idea that I'll circle back to at the very last slide for something that we might be able to do in the future, which is, does a road change state capacity? I think roads are somewhat different from some other forms of government kind of public goods and public service delivery, in that they could very well change the capacity to deliver other services. It is now easier to put up electrical poles or for a teacher to commute in from the nearby town, or you name it, for drugs to be delivered when a health center is out, or you name it, when the village has a road compared to when it doesn't, right? And I think that makes it somewhat different from, like, it's not that the school makes it easier to build a road, it's that potentially a road makes it easier to build a school or staff it or whatever. And so it was of a lot of interest to me in this paper of, do we find that sort of measures of that state capacity, does the delivery of different goods change when you build a road in? We're not seeing much evidence for that, but we're hoping to kind of get into that in greater detail in future work. All right, let me get to the stuff that I'm most excited about. So look, what we've shown so far is that, let me say the income stuff from the previous one as well, because we kind of moved past that quickly. The SECC asks one question of what is the income category of the highest earning member of the household. It's not the way I would have designed the question. It's capturing one person per household, and it's these really lofty categories where 90% of the people, 90% of the households in our sample report below 5,000 rupees. So basically, we're measuring movement on like a pretty far right part of the tail, right? Whereas really, you'd like to be able to characterize the distribution much more richly. But what we do is we take NSS data that gives you the average earnings for each of those groups, for the 5,000 group, for the 5 to 10,000 group, and for the over 10,000 group, and we basically make a guess as to what your earnings are and go take that up to the village level and basically say what are the average earnings per household or of the highest earning members of the household at the village level using that NSS data. Based on the SECC, but using these numbers that come from the NSS. And what we find is that we see about a 10 percentage point increase in earnings, in average earnings. It's pretty noisy. It's hard to attribute that to the reallocation specifically. I should say, given the estimates that the same workers are about twice as productive when they work out of agriculture as when they work in, 10 percentage point increase in earnings is perfectly consistent with a 10 percentage point reallocation from agriculture to non-agriculture. It's consistent with that. I can't say that at all. It's actually not really meaningful to break it up into agricultural earnings versus non-agricultural earnings. We can do it because we have the different households. But it's not really meaningful to do that because there are households that are moving from one category to another, and so we can't say, is this selection or causality? We actually would expect that it's the households least productive in agriculture that are actually going to be the ones who move out. And again, I think, this question is particularly kind of poorly suited to understanding these phenomena because a household is going to have a certain amount of labor income coming in from various members of the household. And then it's going to have a certain amount of agricultural income because many households own some land and do something agricultural, right? I don't know how you attribute that to one member of the household and say this is the earnings of the highest earning member of the household, but that's the way it's done. So that's what we have. And that's why, this paper is not putting much emphasis there. Let me talk about access to urban markets. So, because this is really what I think the kind of punchline of this paper is. In some sense, we're using this to test for do roads allow people to get out of agriculture, but really, I think the richer story here is about linkages between rural and urban labor markets. Okay, and this is a sort of growing area of inquiry. So there's a lot of work out there that suggests that a road is not a road. It's not that all roads are the same or all railroads are the same. It's really the value of transportation infrastructure is in what it connects you to. Likewise, a cell phone doesn't do me much good if none of my friends have cell phones, right? So it's really about what is it connecting you to? What is it getting you access to? And so what we're going to start doing to try to shed some light on this is to just look at these results by straight line distance to these large cities. Kind of like what I showed you in the cross-section from the beginning of the paper. And what we find is that the impacts are very strongly decreasing in distance to the nearest city. So that first coefficient on the left is the average treatment effect. That's what we find, and that's the negative 10 percentage points, right? Negative 0.1. So what we do then is we divide it up by quartile of distance from cities. Okay? And sort of to address your earlier points, you have
differential complier effects.
What's that?
You have differential complier rates, right? Across the...
No, we actually don't. No. So these are the actual, these are the treatment effects estimated off of given whatever the complier rates are, which actually aren't that different anyway. So it doesn't much matter, A, and B, they're not that different, and B, it shouldn't matter because we have a different first stage for each of these regressions that we're running because we literally divide the sample.
Right.
But what you can see here is that basically the point estimates go down as you get further away from the cities. That really these effects are driven by these very large changes in the villages that are close enough to cities to kind of be somewhat integrated with their markets. Now, it's not clear what that means exactly. Is this about goods flowing back and forth? Is this about people flowing back and forth? Like, this is not answering that question. This is just a step in the direction of kind of suggesting that this has something to do with access to urban markets.
This is consistent with your commuting cost story as well in some sense, and that just reaffirms those.
Definitely. Yeah. So this is the first step towards my making that argument.
So you're saying there's not much difference in compliance rates across the quartiles?
So villages are more likely to get roads as you're further in the quartiles, but there aren't differences. That 15 percentage point jump as you cross, that's pretty constant. It changes by 1 or 2 percentage points as you move in these categories.
But the baseline rates are significantly different across the quartiles. That's what you're saying. So like...
The baseline rates are, sure. But these are quartiles within our sample, right? We're dividing just our sample, even though the overall distribution of villages away from cities is generally closer to cities than our sample.
Yeah.
This is just dividing it up into 4 quartiles within the sample that we are using to estimate these effects. Yeah. So quartile 1 is about 50 kilometers away from a city, as the crow flies. So that's going to be longer in terms of driving, right? And the fact is, when you start dividing up your sample into 4, you get bigger and bigger standard errors. And so one of the things that would be really nice to tell is, like, quartiles 2 and 3, are those effects 0, or are they kind of smaller but still kind of people moving out of agriculture? Is this really about just quartile 1, just being close enough to a city to be able to commute? Are those just the people who are reallocating, or is it kind of linearly or otherwise decaying?
You also find a mild positive effect in quartile 4.
Yeah, I don't want to overinterpret that. I mean, the standard errors are so big, right, that like you can't even reject that with 40% probability. So like, or 30% probability. So yeah. Okay. Again, coming back to Partho's question of what we can do with this that's different from the census, we can look at exactly who is it that's getting out of agriculture. Again, is this consistent with our story of, now that you've lowered the transportation costs, those that have the highest gains from getting out of ag and getting into some other sector, are those the people who are reallocating? And so we look at 4 particular characteristics of individuals and households in particular. 1 is landholding, because the smaller your landholding, sort of the more you stand to gain from getting out of agriculture. 2 is age. There's some evidence. 1 is that younger people may be better at searching for new jobs or getting into new activities, or they have less agricultural human capital built up that they'd be giving up if they are, in fact, getting out of agriculture. As well as knowing from the Korean structural transformation example, at least, that really the movement of the Korean economy out of agriculture, which happened really dramatically over the second half of the 20th century, was driven by young people. It was driven by new entrants into the labor force who, instead of following their fathers generally into agriculture, took jobs in cities and took jobs in other sectors of the economy. We look at gender because of we see stigmas about women working outside the home or working outside the village, as well as just greater likelihood of being in household work. And then finally by caste. There's a certain literature out there that suggests that there's quite a lot of discrimination against low caste people in labor markets, particularly in rural areas. And so if this is about starting to get access to kind of new labor markets, it may be that sort of the people who face the most discrimination are those who are going to benefit the most from getting out of the villages. That might be considered like the Ambedkar story. Okay, so what do we find? We find the largest effects are for those with small land holdings. That's who we kind of expect. It's driven by men. We find these small negative and insignificant effects for women, but they're so close to 0 that we really can't say whether women are in fact getting out of agriculture. We might have actually expected, given that men seem to be getting out of agriculture, that women would have moved into it to make up for their labor. And it's low-caste households that are moving out. But we actually don't see differences on age. So if you split by like 20 to 40 versus 40 to 60, we really don't see any differences. It's men moving out of agriculture, but it's older men and it's younger men pretty much equally.
So, Sam,
Yeah.
low caste conditional on landholding?
Right, so this is what I need to... So I think did you ask me this last week? And I promised you an answer at some point, and I still don't have it? I think that may have happened. Someone asked me last week. I still don't have that answer. So part of this question is saying, look, low-caste people also have small landholdings, and so is this about people with small landholdings getting out? Is this about people who are low-caste getting out, or is this some combination of the two? It requires an entire recollapse of our data down from the microdata to the village level in order to generate those kind of results, and so I haven't done it yet. I will. Yeah, we don't know that yet, and I think it would be interesting. just touch on this for a second because this is a slide I leave in for my policy presentations. Maintenance is a really big deal. Everyone gets really excited about building new roads. People don't generally put a lot of emphasis on maintaining the roads that exist. And that's a terrible thing for countries like India, but also for countries like the United States, where our infrastructure is also completely falling apart. And it's gotten so bad that even Donald Trump is making hay out of saying that he's going to fix our infrastructure. What you see here is the probability that a village that had a road in the 2001 census still has a road in the 2011 census. So this is sort of like total deterioration. Obviously the roads are deteriorating, but governments do something about it, right? And so if the government did something about it, then you still have a paved road. But if things deteriorate so badly that you can be recategorized from having had a paved road to not having had a paved road because it's basically all washed away. And just to give an anecdotal example, I was out talking to people in a few PMGSY villages in Bihar, about 40 kilometers outside of Patna, and I specifically chose villages that didn't have a road at baseline because I wanted to know what changed when you actually got a new road. And they said, this wasn't a new road, we had roads. We had roads back in the 50s and 60s. And then they deteriorated because there was absolutely no maintenance, and it got so bad that there was no road left anymore. But basically, and you see huge kind of differences across the different states. States like Gujarat and Haryana, almost 100% of villages that had roads in 2001 still had roads 10 years later. You get down to West Bengal and Rajasthan, and those numbers are close to or below 50%. And this is despite PMGSY, right? So PMGSY is doing some amount of upgradation and blah, 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 but it's not doing it there. Okay, let's get to the mechanism. So I suggested that the sort of city results are suggestive, but to be honest, the fact that the big reallocation of labor out of agriculture is happening in the areas close to cities does not say that this is about people going to work in the cities. It could be because those areas are the ones where it's advantageous to start a job, to start like a new business, right? Or it could be that those areas have enough of the other inputs like electricity and other kind of goods delivered by the state that they're actually good places to start work. It's not, or it's consistent with some sort of commuting or short-term migration into the cities. Any of these things could be happening. And so we want to pick apart the different channels. So, and this is a real challenge with roads, right? Because roads are facilitating the movement of goods in, goods out, people in, and people out. And the ultimate effects that we see on the local economy could really be driven by any of these things. So we consider basically three stories that we think capture the range of what could be going on, more or less. So one is you see an increase. We know that there's increased agricultural employment, or non-agricultural employment. One could be that it's an increase of non-agricultural employment within the village. Businesses are starting up. People are working within the village. They're still living in the same villages. We established that earlier. But people are still working in the villages, but doing different things. Before I was working on my farm, now I'm working in a call center, or whatever. The second is access to external labor markets. I'm living in the village, but now the PMGSY road helps me go work elsewhere, most likely in the city. The third, which we dismiss relatively quickly, is what I generally call a grapes of wrath story, which is that actually a road coming in could change the nature of agriculture in the village and actually lead to a decrease in demand for agricultural labor.
Now I can buy tractors, so no longer.
Yeah, you're replaced by tractors, farms are consolidating, and so you don't need as many people to work on a consolidated plot, like you name it. So basically on that third one, what we do is we look at ownership of tractors and consolidation of plots, average land holdings, and we don't see any evidence that those are changing. And so we say it's very unlikely that this is being driven by any sort of decrease in demand for agricultural labor. We also, because we see those gains to income, however poorly measured, that also isn't consistent with it, because we would think that actually if there's kind of a big negative shock in demand for labor in some sector, that's probably going to show up in the opposite direction in overall earnings.
Sam, I don't know how much we have, but that is one place where I really just focus your stuff only on villages that got connected 2006, something like that sort. Because
you want villages that were connected long enough ago that these sort of changes could shake out.
This is sort of the traditional stuff, long run cost curves.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not.
You don't expect instantaneous changes to landholding distributions or picking up tractors or that kind of thing. Yeah.
That's not hard to do. Just a subsample.
Yeah. Yeah, we can do that. Okay. The second one that we can, so we ruled out number 3. So we rule out number 1, basically using the SECC, but hopefully very soon using the economic census. And we show here that basically we don't see any evidence of growth in non-farm firms within the villages that got roads. We don't see it in the likelihood that a household reports a business as their primary source of earnings. If anything, actually that's going down, which I think might have some interesting implications for sort of the nature of entrepreneurship and business in rural India. And we see households are less likely to own a registered business. It's a noisy negative, so basically 0. But basically neither one of these are pointing towards sort of growth in the number of firms in the non-farm sector that might be employing all of these people who are getting out of agriculture. And really the economic census is going to be the final piece of that story. So really what that leaves is people continuing to live in these rural areas but working in external labor markets. And we have a couple of pieces of evidence here, in addition to that being the only story left standing based on the evidence that we have. So one is that if this is the case, really the prediction is, we've lowered transportation costs. We've now allowed people to arbitrage the gaps in earnings between agriculture and non-agriculture, which it looks like is between agriculture and outside non-agricultural jobs, right? So what we do is we use the NSS to generate these rural-urban wage gaps at the district level, okay? So we're calculating the gap in earnings for a low-skilled person, trying to hold skills constant, so we're just doing this for unskilled laborers. How much do you earn working in a rural area? How much do you earn in an urban area? Okay? And we compare those two average wages. And we come up with a gap which represents how much do I sort of gain by not working in a rural area instead of working in an urban area. So some districts it's very close to 0. Basically, the urban areas aren't paying that much higher for unskilled labor than rural areas. Some districts it's really big. And so we divide our sample in half, or the districts in half, and we say these districts are below median, which is pretty close to 0 for these rural urban wage gaps, and these districts have pretty large gaps where it would be really nice to arbitrage that and go make urban wages rather than rural wages. The prediction there is that it's in the districts that have the large gaps that we should see this reallocation, or we should see much more reallocation in the areas that have the large gaps, right? And that's exactly what we see. We find estimates that are indistinguishable for 0 in the districts that have low rural urban wage gaps. And we find these very strong effects, approximately double the average effect size in areas where the urban earnings are much higher. Okay? Again, suggesting that this is the result of roads facilitating this arbitrage. The second piece of evidence comes from transportation services. If people are, in fact, going back and forth, we should see a sort of commensurate effect in transportation services. People are riding something to go back and forth, right? And anecdotally, being out in these villages, they basically said more buses and jeeps, more regular services are going back and forth because people are taking them back and forth to the towns. The census, very nicely, asked the question of, is there a regular scheduled bus service to your village? And so we use that measure and we say, is there an effect on bus service as a result of getting the roads? And it's exactly, the bus service effects are large, exactly where the reallocation effects are large. So in that first quartile of distance from cities, that's exactly where we see an increase in bus service at the same time as we see this increase in people working outside of agriculture. So I think that, all of this really points towards this story of people, roads like this, short roads, 4-kilometer roads, they don't change the permanent migration story. If you stand to gain so much by migrating permanently, yeah, it's a little tiny bit easier when you have a 4-kilometer paved road, but it's not dramatically changing that calculus. But what is really changing is the calculus of somebody who's considering going back and forth frequently, right? The more you use a road, the more it's worth to you. And so this is, we think, the kind of economic activity that roads facilitate. Quick aside, I was talking to an agricultural economist from the University of Wisconsin, and he told me a very interesting fact. In Iowa and Wisconsin are near each other, I'm told. Wisconsin, dairy is the major agricultural industry. In Iowa, corn is the major agricultural activity. Okay? Those are different in one very particular way. Dairy, you have to go back and forth every day or almost every day. You got to get the milk out fast. The milk goes bad quickly, right? Whereas with corn, you get inputs in a couple times a year and you get outputs out a couple times a year. And so they're much less kind of road intensive than the dairy industry is. Every farm has a paved road going all the way up to the farm gate in Wisconsin, and almost none does in Iowa. Okay? So really, it's this sort of frequency story that really matters for making road investments, or rather for what we think the returns might be on road investments. Yeah.
So hearing yours and bus stories seems like there's a lurking variable here, which is an existing network of roads you can connect to. Right? So you build a road that's like 200 kilometers from a city. It's hard to get a bus between there and the city, right? Or anywhere. So, I mean, I just wonder, I have no idea how one would get
But I
it.
think that's exactly what he's finding. He's
No,
finding that.
but external, but the effect is on, I built a road,
Right.
and it's in this quartile. But,
No,
Right.
I think the point is well taken. Look, anytime you start getting into heterogeneity,
right.
you're basically, anytime you cut it a certain way, you're saying, I find that the results are different in this sample, which I've defined based on variable x, but I'm really picking up the effect of variable x and all variables x prime that are correlated with that one, right? And so all of this is sort of instructive, but these would never be headline results.
No, and that's fine.
Right.
I mean, well, for political scientists, we're more interested in this stuff, right? I mean, just because...
No, I think we are too, because,
No.
is this, I've made the argument in this that this is about cities,
Yeah.
but you could be right that it's about density of the road network.
Right.
And so,
the two are related.
the two are very related. But I could throw in some controls for how many of the villages around me have paved roads
Something like
as a measure of kind of the density of the road network, which is correlated with proximity to the city, but is not.
Because also, you know how
co-linear
these bus services work. Like, they stop somewhere near a lot of villages,
Yeah.
right? And then everyone's,
with- And new bus services are very likely to extend from where old bus services as well, right? So,
I mean, the other sort of related question I have, just trying to put your story together with the effects that you cited in previous slides, is that, so, the effect is strongest among SC low landholding families, right? That's true. Now, you got,
No. Started among SC.
well, yeah. Right. Marginal effects of these two. Okay, right. So, now you got very zero-looking effects for other populations. You just have positive, insignificant effects. So the reason why I'm wondering is, it's kind of a weird market mechanism to think about. The substitution effect only works for this one group, and there aren't marginal effects for people who are more well off.
So we do find significant effects for other groups. They're just much smaller in two ways. So to take the SC effect, right? I think we ended up estimating that SCs, there is I have to remember the paper, but I'm going to get the numbers close, but not exactly right. I think we find, wait. Okay, so
There's effects of that. Yeah.
So here you go.
Yeah.
So scheduled tribes, we find no effect. We find 10% significant effect for general. That's actually not that far off from the average effects that we're finding of 10%, right? And if we divided this up by distance to cities, we'd probably find pretty strong effects in those first quartiles where we find the strong.
Why
effects
don't you argue your case in that way? Just in the same way that you talked about distance from the city. This seems like a much more naturally economic way of thinking about.
What, distance from city?
No, like this, right? The idea being that, a scheduled caste is, the substitution effect is going to be much stronger for them. They're much poorer. There's a much stronger increase to being able to work in the city.
I'm very sure that applies to fast because his original sample is stuck up in northern India because the southern Indian guys are not listening to the rules.
These rules, they might have followed
these
these
kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
My own sense is whatever story you're going to tell, unless this is essentially a poverty story, going to be linked a lot of variation across states depending on what is happening to scheduled castes in those states.
Let me make another reason why I don't put too much emphasis on this, which is, I think this is really interesting. And obviously, I put it in the paper and I put it in the presentation. I'm selling this to an audience beyond just India. I actually think that the primary consumers of this research, in some sense, are outside of India, because India is committed to building roads in every village, and it at least looks like they're pretty likely to do that eventually. in sub-Saharan Africa, take Tanzania, 98% of roads are unpaved, and many places don't even have an unpaved road, let alone a paved road. So, I think the primary consumers of this research in some sense are actually going to be those places that are considering making very large investments in these or other types of roads. Caste doesn't mean a lot outside of India. And so I think this is really interesting for my Indian audiences, and I put more emphasis on it when I'm presenting this here, but it's very hard to tell people. Frankly, I think it's hard to interpret in India. Because what is this? Is this about discrimination? Is this about poverty? Is this about education?
No, but
there's so many things that are correlated with caste that it's
Right.
very, very difficult to interpret the caste results specifically. Now, what Partha suggested, let's kind of divide it up into low land, low caste, high land, low caste, and look at these different effects, and we'll learn something there. But, I think it's interesting. I think it's food for thought. I think it's maybe the subject for further inquiry. It's not fundamentally changing the argument of this paper, which is roads help people get access to external labor markets. Right?
But you should see different marginal. So to be able to demonstrate different marginal effects across different populations that will gain more or less.
The table for your landholding?
Do you have a landhold? Yeah, maybe that'll help.
I think that will be a. Yeah, that's.
Yeah, so there's no margin. Well, maybe there's too small.
So, look, we don't have the power to tell. It could
That's
very
what I'm
well be
saying.
that there's an effect, right?
Yeah, right.
It's just we don't have enough power.
What's going on with the land list?
The land list, there's also a very small negative, but it's noisy. Look at the outcome means here. I think this is important. Actually, let's go back to the scheduled cast one, because the scheduled cast results are even more striking when you consider this. Both of them are, actually. We'll go back to that one. The scheduled casts, you're seeing this 17 percentage point exit from agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
That's bigger than the 7.6 that you're seeing in general.
Right.
But it's even more striking when you consider the baseline that they're moving from. It's that scheduled castes in general are much less likely to be in agriculture in the first place.
Right.
Are much less likely to be farming in the first place. They're the ones who don't own land. It's the general castes who generally are the landowners and are so much more likely to be in agriculture. And so if you kind of scale this number by this as a denominator, you have a much higher rate of exit from agriculture, a much kind of greater share of the population that's reallocating in scheduled caste than you do in generals. Right? And the exact same thing goes for landholdings. It might be because they're the same groups. These might not be independent results, right?
Is there?
Look how much less likely you are to be in agriculture if you own only 0 to 1 acre of land, or even are landless, compared to 1 plus.
You're already in some way.
So you've already exited, right? But then this is kind of saying for the people who are remaining, you get out much faster if you don't have much land.
Because I wouldn't look at the first column at all, because it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Landless guy in agriculture, what are we talking about, right? Unless.
They could be agricultural laborers, right? They could be sharecroppers. They could be.
Sharecroppers is a possibility, but how do you classify agricultural labor?
If I can observe you as agricultural labor, I put you in agriculture.
Agriculture. So, in which case, I'm curious about your scheduled caste numbers. And it'll be interesting to see how there's that 250,000 that you're sort of grouping into these occupations, because I wouldn't expect. Let's just put it up. These are numbers that we can actually put out of the census. Scheduled caste in agricultural labor, things of that sort.
Yeah.
And do they look similar? Because I'm just wondering. That's to my mind as a low. It's a reasonable number if I'm talking about people who are farming. It's a low number if I'm talking about people who are farming and agricultural labor.
Yeah.
So that's, but it's a hunch. I haven't actually looked at the numbers, so we're going to pull out the census numbers to see whether it's right or wrong.
But the estimates for India as a whole is that somewhere around 50% of the workforce is in agriculture, which includes agricultural labor.
Yes, and that number I think would be slightly higher for scheduled caste.
Higher for scheduled caste. I see.
Including the split between labor.
Yeah. They're much more likely to be in labor, and they're much less likely to be primary cultivated.
Right. But if you're lumping them together, then I'm a little just wondering what's going on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is, So look at these baseline numbers here, right? So look at the cultivation column and look at the agricultural column here.
Right.
We know that in India, about 50% of the workforce is in agriculture, one way or the other. I think I'm measuring that pretty well because I have 45% here, right? This number's a little bit lower, but still pretty close.
Yeah, which is why, I mean, if you're looking at the SC households and seeing roughly about only 20 to 25% is in agriculture, that's what's making me.
I see.
You know, because there isn't really that much non-agricultural labor work opportunities in villages
Unless they're going elsewhere.
if it's not agriculture, it's construction.
Yeah, it's going outside of the village and doing something somewhere else, right? Yeah.
Yes, they're already, and I don't think it's that high. But
I mean, I think part of the problem is that we measure this stuff absolutely terribly, right? Because
no, but in your sense, no. But I mean, because you do have a very rich. You are collapsing a variety of things.
I am collapsing a variety of things. I mean,
And I'm just wondering whether you're putting things in things that.
right? That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's right.
That's
That's right. I guess what I was saying about measurement here, so part of it is about specificity of your kind of occupation. I guess where I think we're measuring things very poorly is because most people, particularly in rural India, don't have just one job. It's very well and good for those of us who have formal occupations and get a very specific paycheck from a very specific employer to say, like, this is my job. Even there, it's somewhat difficult to report, right? And we work on a variety of different things. You do some teaching, you do some research, you do some sitting on committees, you name it. But when it comes to rural India, I mean, if you look at the NSS, it looks like for people who report kind of doing cultivation as their primary occupation, they spend an awful lot of time doing other things too. It looks like they spend as much as like a third of their time doing other stuff. And likewise for people who report non-agricultural occupations, they spend an awful lot of time doing agriculture. And so, and even those measures I don't think are that great. But it's just kind of indicative that like there's a big split here, right? So in some sense, what I'm measuring is, I think when you're asking someone what's your occupation, they're giving you the sort of plurality answer, right? They're saying, what do I do more than anything else? And
I wish Shyam was here because I don't know if there's a response bias. In the sense that would scheduled castes choose to downplay their cultural story and play up some other story if it's self-reported story, all of that stuff. Right? But my first and simplest thing is to ask, since you are taking some broad number and mapping them into something else, whether that mapping is,
I mean, so look, what we're saying here is the result we're finding. So take it just in the occupation, because we're measuring it two ways, right? We're doing it in the households and we're doing it in the occupation. You're telling me there's not that much non-agricultural manual labor to do, so when we see a household that's reporting their primary source of income as manual labor, you think that's still agriculture?
well, I mean, it could be construction, and because there's a lot of construction happening.
Right.
But, I mean, I wouldn't expect those, especially by large groups, I wouldn't expect that number to be like
So
this.
you want us to do a sanity check against some of the other numbers for within group numbers on how many people are actually working in it?
Yeah.
Because, I mean, for a lot of the stuff that you have presented, you could run that same stuff right off the 2011 census, right?
Yeah, so that's what I mean, so you and I are going to talk about the 2011 census after this presentation,
Sure.
right? So, because those census definitions of those four categories, cultivation, agricultural labor, household, and other, strike me as bizarre. And from what I can tell, I think that they're lumping in general manual laborers into agricultural laborers. Now, in some sense, what you're saying is maybe that's right, because actually manual labor, what they're doing is agriculture. Or I could say it's wrong because they're doing a whole bunch of other
That's right. And we have some of that story at the in principle they are capturing at a different level because construction is captured differently at the census. So it isn't a four category data capture. We are capturing data with a larger number of categories. You just classify.
Oh, they're
them.
classifying it down.
Right.
I see.
So what they're doing. So
Yeah.
in some senses, they therefore should be classifying. They are. I mean, at least the district numbers seem to say that we classify construction as other.
It's
That's,
different types of
that's
labor.
clear.
I see.
Would, and we can talk about that. But the other thing is, I'm just wondering why, if you have the data and if you're not using it, because we're talking about all this transport and the bus and so on, at that level of classification, are you able to find out people engaged in transport in your data set?
No. Yes. Sorry. Yes. If it says driver.
Yeah, and what,
Yeah.
mechanic, driver, something,
No,
whatever.
that's right. That's right. Absolutely.
And is that something that you can?
I can look into that. I would. Transport occupations.
How did you classify?
My prior, and I suspect you'll at least share this somewhat with me, I hope. My prior is strongly that we're not going to find anything on that. Because from all the villages that I've been to, the reason why we're not finding higher ownership of four-wheelers is not because four-wheelers aren't going back and forth to these villages, but because they're not owned by people in these newly connected villages.
Exactly.
And likewise, these... Was that?
Or they are not reported.
It's CCC.
No. Fine. Yeah, no. I don't disagree that we have some reporting issues, but I'm just saying, on the ground, these Jeeps are not owned by these relatively small villages. The drivers are probably also coming from the towns and things where
That part I'm not quite sure.
maybe I can look at it. I can look it
So
up.
it's the first part.
Yeah.
Agree.
Yeah.
The second part, I'm not too sure about what's happening.
Maybe. Yeah, we can totally look at that. Yeah.
That's the.
I have it as a category, so I can totally generate it, and we just haven't. But
So, as a quick question, it's a categorization question.
Yeah.
What do you do for people who are working in the home, like people working with BDs or people who are like manufacturing stuff on saris at home?
right. So if they say housework,
Mhm.
then we count them as not working,
Yeah, but they
But-
wouldn't say housework,
right?
Yeah.
But if they say BDs,
Yeah.
then we count them as BD makers.
Okay, so that is not counting. That is counting as non-agricultural work.
No.
Yeah, there are also industry.
And that's because that's also not counting as the entrepreneur. That's also wasn't in your entrepreneurial check, right? You said you had these three mechanisms, and you saw that
Owning businesses.
Yeah,
you're
so
saying,
they're
stuff
not
like
owned-
that?
yeah.
Yeah, I don't think they're owning businesses.
they're certainly
I
not.
think-
Yeah,
Yeah, no. I think that's right.
because there is a reason to think
Yeah,
that you would
I see what you mean.
have higher penetration of those kinds of industries into villages as well once there's connectivity.
Okay.
There are more middlemen going back and forth.
Well, no. So, right, two things. You're totally right that if I have a small BD rolling enterprise in my house,
BD is actually the worst one because of where it actually ends up being rolled. But yeah, I mean, but people who are working
yeah,
on
let's say we're doing something, we're
saris.
making rugs or whatever,
Yeah, exactly.
like you see
Right.
across UP or whatever,
Right.
right? That's gonna not show up in one of our measures of business in the SECC because the SECC says, "Do you have a registered business?" And there's no freaking way that those kind of little things are ever going to be registered, right? So it's not going to show up there. It is going to show up in. It should show up in the household's primary source of earnings because one of those is a business, and that question doesn't care whether it's registered or not or anything. I have a little rug making business.
no, but they're not the business.
Not the
They're
problem.
they're the
I mean, even the first, I'm not quite sure because panchayats collect taxes from businesses,
I see.
and consequently,
I see.
there is a certain. I mean, so it depends.
They're not going to get onto the ASI rules, but
yeah,
you think they're
shops and establish all of that stuff, but depends on how they are.
thinking of it.
Yes.
Yeah, I see.
So I'm not quite sure how it sort of ends up finally, but you might want to. I mean, it'd be interesting to look at. I mean, it's and maybe as you come up, as you said, look at the economic census comes up.
Exactly. That's what I really want to compare, right? Because the economic census is doing it going door to door.
Yeah,
so
so-
that's less of a sort of people deciding whether they think they're operating a business, and more like do the definitions think.
because a woman putting shiny things on saris, giving it to a
doesn't think of
middleman,
herself as a
is
business.
she's not doing a business, right?
But it is.
No, but then it should show up as other. Honestly, if that business is picking up and becomes the dominant source of income for a household, that's going to show up as other. That's so the household earnings.
Yeah.
The question is, what is the primary source of earnings for the household? Now, I don't think that's a great question, but
Can't be anything done by a fee.
I see. Even if that's bringing in more cash, that's your opinion.
Unless it's a fee.
Yeah, no, I understand.
That was a trap question.
Yeah,
and you fell for it.
Yeah, it does. Good. Okay.
I mean, it is an opinion. There's nothing, I mean,
No, you're right.
you have to run that stuff because it's essentially a response to it. It's,
No, exactly. It's what's their sense of what the primary source of earnings is. No, totally. Okay. Yeah.
If you go back that graphic about maintenance, what's the basis for that? The probability of the resistance of roads. What is your basis?
The two senses.
So it's a two. So you have
It has a
PCO1.
road in 2001 census, does not have a road.
What could be the reason? It's okay, that's the data. What could be the reason? Is it because there are maintenance programs in those
So
states?
every road falls apart, right? You talk to
in those states like Gujarat, Haryana.
like what's with the variation? Right. Yeah, these guys are taking care of. Those guys are taking care of their roads. Those guys aren't taking care of their roads.
Actually, as you can see, look, until you get to UP, you are 80%.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not, I mean, it's what I'm surprised by is Bengal because just simply both politically and what I know of the place. But otherwise, I don't know whether he's been around.
I should say another thing. So I said despite PMGSY this is the case, it could totally be because of PMGSY this is the case, right? Yeah. It could be that all the emphasis is on new road construction and all of these villages are getting kind of like left behind because all of the headline programs are
These are PMGSY roads.
No.
Oh, okay.
This is just the census.
I mean, do you have a road before? Not do you have a road?
PMGSY activities will go into whether you report one or the other.
I mean, the other way I can look at Bengal is they've been told don't say there is a road or they'll never get PMGSY money, so say no road. Whichever way. I don't know.
No, Bengal always shows up very low on these numbers. The surface we're talking. I mean, any road measure of paved road, Bengal is.
I mean, you roam around there a bit. I don't more than I do, but I mean, you get that sense.
Let's see what the first 5 years of Mamta look like on roads. If there's not an obvious increase, then something's wrong with the number.
It's more something to say about the institutional story. I mean, if there are institutions that are in place in these states,
they all state PWD.
They're all what?
State PWDs. State. If you're talking about the roads that connect to the villages, they are actually not PWDs.
No, but I think in reality, there is a wide range of different bodies that are doing something about this. I think
it's part of the movement. Is that we don't know whose responsibility it is to perform.
so. Like in some places, the panchayats take it onto themselves to like repair the roads, right? They say we've had enough with this crappy road, and the government's not being responsive. We're repairing this road.
Panchayats within the village.
What he's saying is panchayats just because if they have the money, they just go ahead and do it, and nobody stops.
And you hear stories of this. I mean, I don't know.
But technically speaking, those roads,
are supposed to be maintained by public works. Yeah.
Not major districts, other districts.
No, ODR again is different. You see, this is also the PMGSY roads linked to ODR.
Trying to move to the next slide.
Not. It's up to ODR.
Everything else is ODR.
Not so clearly. It's actually ODR's other district roads. Which are not major district headquarters to district headquarters.
You are doing the, I mean, I don't know. If you look at a PWD engineer, and if you are finding it, so this is I would be very surprised because PWDs would want it, right? Because it's more money.
They would want it, provided they have budget for it.
Let's put this off. Let me wrap up. It seems like a lot of people have to go. And then we can take this off on. Alright, so look, we estimated the impact of PMGSY, largest road program in history. We find that roads facilitate this reallocation out of agriculture and helps to explain why so many people in low-income countries who live in rural areas are sort of, in some sense, stuck in agriculture. We find these really big effects in the areas that are close to cities, and we think that the evidence points to, though I don't think it quite nails, this story of people living rural and working urban, and roads like this as facilitating this flow back and forth. I think it also really speaks to the role that cities play in driving rural economic outcomes. Okay? And so it's this combination of the city being nearby and the road connecting the two that kind of allow people to get out of agriculture, and that in the absence of those two factors, we don't see too much of that. It should also be pointed out that despite these findings, roads are definitely no panacea. We don't find really huge gains
in measures of income and in measures of assets. Things are not rapidly changing. I also think it helps to explain something that a lot of sort of economists have been puzzled by, which is the diverging experiences of India and sub-Saharan Africa. Now, obviously, there are many things going on that are different between the two, but one thing that we see in lockstep is those two dotted lines are India and sub-Saharan Africa, their agricultural employment share. And so what you see is that basically they're moving together, going from almost 70% in 1980 down to about 50% in 2015. These are according to the FDA numbers. Or no, this is FAO. However, sub-Saharan Africa has urbanized, despite growing more slowly than India over this period. Sub-Saharan Africa has urbanized much, much faster. So people in India are continuing to work in rural areas, but are doing things other than agriculture, okay, in a way that's not happening in sub-Saharan Africa. What I think that this paper at least says might be going on is that a lot of Indians living in rural areas are either close enough or well enough connected to urban areas that they're actually able to do non-agricultural things while still living in predominantly agricultural areas, okay? And that's not possible with much, much lower population densities and much higher transportation costs in places like Tanzania and Kenya. Okay? And let me just touch on kind of what we're hoping to do in the future. We're going to do a couple of things to touch on that question that I mentioned earlier of do roads have complementarities with other forms of state capacity and service delivery? So one, we're looking at do roads affect investments in education? It may be actually that the first order effect of a road on growth doesn't come from the same low-skilled people moving out of agriculture into something else, but actually more people getting educated. If that's actually happening, that's probably going to dominate whatever short-term effects we're finding. And we actually do find that more people stay in school when you build a road. And it seems to be at the upper primary level that this is taking place. It looks like there are these sort of two competing effects. On the one hand, there's an income effect, which allows you to keep your kids in school. This is a long-term investment, and so the more income and liquidity I have, the more likely to keep them in school. On the other hand, there's a dropout effect that comes from the fact that the road is probably giving you a higher incentive to drop out your kids right now, because they can go and earn more money than they were able to before the village actually had a road. And we have some evidence that kind of suggests this, that I can talk to you guys about if you're interested. The second one...
That's your conclusion as well.
That's another paper that we're...
Besides Pallavi Kanda's work?
No, so Pallavi's work is on health, right?
Yeah, so...
What's that?
Shilpa provides.
Oh, Shilpa's paper. No. So I told you earlier why I don't think that I don't believe Shilpa's findings at all. Basically, I was more diplomatic in a smaller group. I don't know why I decided to be more direct in a larger one. But basically, look, when you're correlating road construction with everything else, it's going to be correlated with everything else. Like the fact is that the districts in Bihar were the most eligible, the highest priority in PMGSY because they were the ones that had the lowest share of villages having roads at baseline. There was not a single PMGSY road built in Bihar till 2005. They didn't build any roads in Bihar in the first 5 years of the program. Okay, the implementation of PMGSY is it's going through the local state. So the lower the state capacity and the worse things are, the fewer PMGSY roads also get built. Even though it's supposed to be the exact opposite. PMGSY also had a prioritization for left-wing extremism affected areas, and far fewer roads got built there than in the areas that were lower priority, right? So basically, more PMGSY roads get put into places that are better off to begin with, that are growing, that have high prospects and whatever else, that have growing state capacity. So I think it's very tricky to do these results at the district level and argue that this is the effect of PMGSY. This is the effect of governance defined broadly, and that's showing up in higher PMGSY numbers, higher enrollment numbers, and everything else. That's why it's so important to do things like the regression discontinuity to try to really get at the causal effects. Even though it allows us to ask far fewer questions because we don't have as much data at the village level as we do at any other level, even with all the investments that Paul and I have made in village level data. That's how I actually feel about the overall stuff. So we also want to know whether transportation costs are actually facilitating the delivery of other programs. And so we want to look at NREGA as well as some measures that we have of teacher quality, of test scores at the local level, and say, is the education system operating better now that the village has a road? It's going to be challenging because it looks like enrollment is also changing. And so the composition of the student body is changing. But at least on things like teacher quality, we may be able to try to understand, is the road actually helping villages get higher quality teachers? It's something that you hear a lot, but to the best of my knowledge, there's absolutely zero empirical evidence on it.
I think it would be more interesting to see if they actually go to school which is outside the village.
Yeah.
Which
So
may
we,
not be a public school.
For your upper primary schools, for example, those are much more likely to be farther away from the immediate walk through.
yeah.
3 p.m. is the
Yeah.
official.
So when we, so look, the only thing, we need to be able to measure kind of schooling down at the village level, right? And basically that means DICE. DICE is the only data set that allows you to do this. DICE doesn't tell you where the students are coming from, it just tells you, based on a school that is located in this village, what is enrollment in this year, right? What we tried to do, so where those kids are coming from, I can't exactly say. They may be coming from nearby. We tried, I could do something on this to say, in those, when a village gets it that has an upper primary school, do they have a differential effect when the nearby villages do or don't have upper primary schools, right? So that could,
like kind of some sort of a cluster of
yeah. So we could do something based on a cluster, and is the school there as opposed to somewhere nearby? We could do something like that, upper primary. But the fact is that basically we're stuck with the data we have, and so that's what we got.
So what you're saying is take two villages, one with an upper primary school and a PMGSY, the other with an upper primary school and no PMGSY. The first one would show a
Higher enrollment. Yeah.
as compared to the other.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what we find. Now, the question here was, are those kids coming from that village or are they coming in from nearby villages? In some sense, for the headline results, I don't care, right? Like it's encouraging schooling. I think it is an important secondary result because I think that it speaks to, do villages kind of help families keep kids in school? Or
Given the fact that you have this level, isn't that something you can read off the age distribution for village? Is that increase something that could come from the village, given the age distribution of the village? Or does that increase have to be something outside?
All right, I'll have to think about it more. My preliminary answer is no, I don't think that's going to help because every village basically has a sufficiently large pool of kids. It's not like, if we were finding absolutely massive effects, then yeah, we would have to explain them as coming from beyond the village, right? But we're finding like a few percentage point increase in enrollment in the village. Generally, every village has enough kids who aren't going to school that you have enough kids that could be doing it. No? I mean, I can check.
I mean, at least we believe the enrollment number is almost high.
More than 95%.
It's not, I don't think you have that much.
But even 95%, we're talking about a few percentage point increase in enrollment. That could still be coming from the village, right? It has to be larger than 100 minus whatever the enrollment rate is. And those numbers are lower in rural areas that don't have roads, or didn't have roads. I'll check.
Yeah,
but I think we're gonna get more empirical traction by saying, is there a differential effect when the nearby village to you also has an upper primary school or doesn't also have an upper primary school? So in other words, is it providing you with additional people that could be coming to yours or not?
Ideally speaking, we want that thing to be the connected village.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, ideally, yeah.
You want to see if
You know what? We could even do that because we know that the road goes through villages A, B, C, and D. We haven't been using that part of it, but we know that it hits these four. So I could say the other villages take multi-village roads. The other villages that are on it, do they or do they not have upper primary schools also? And try to get some traction
The
there.
entire data set doing the network analysis. You may want to create
Locally,
for
yeah.
For these many thousand villages.
Yeah.
that you actually-
No, you're right. Yeah, I like that.
I think what I was trying to
Is there a data provided?
not the
You're talking about the institutions, right? If I have a road in my village, now I have a choice of school which I otherwise wouldn't have. So rather than going to a village school, now I can go to a nearby school. So the institution story can actually run the other way around.
It could go the other way around. Yeah, I mean that's what's.
And that's why I was wondering if, I mean, I'm not very familiar with, but if you have access to, and DICE is not the, it doesn't show only drawbacks, but yeah, I mean, yeah. But I mean, that was what I was heading towards. I mean, if I have access to nearby private school, why would I then go to government school, which is in my village? I will probably go. Then what implication does that have on?
More often that is the case.
Yeah.
If you see dropout rates in the villages, PMGS,
You would think that that's actually being driven by attending somewhere else.
most likely that's
Yeah, that's what we saw in these Bihari villages that we went to. I mean, we literally rode the bus with kids or the jeep with kids who were coming back from school.
if you look at the Bihar advertorial of the video, it's mostly using the students' buses riding.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the fact is we're finding increases in enrollment. It is a challenge of this paper that we can't follow all the kids in the village.
And effects are probably stronger closer to the city.
Yeah, right.
Exactly.
Right. No, I think that's right. And that's it. So thank you very much.
Great. Great.